Some miracles begin not with brilliant scientists or advanced machines, but with a quiet human who refuses to stop trying. The Thalira estate rose above the California coastline like a palace carved from silver and glass, its curved towers catching the warm glow of the late afternoon sun as waves rolled steadily against the cliffs below. Inside the vast mansion, soft blue lights shimmered along the walls, illuminating alien artwork that shifted gently as people walked past, paintings that seemed almost alive. For most visitors, the estate represented unimaginable wealth, the home of Lady Soraya, a Saruan entrepreneur whose interstellar trade network stretched across half a dozen star systems. To the outside world, she was powerful, composed, and untouchable. But inside the west wing of the mansion, behind a quiet hallway that overlooked the ocean, there was a room where hope had quietly faded away. Daniel Carter stood outside that room holding a small data tablet, wondering for the third time that morning what he was doing there. At 34 years old, Daniel had never expected to work inside the mansion of a millionaire alien family. His resume listed biomedical engineering and physical therapy research, though the funding for his doctorate had collapsed 2 years earlier, leaving him bouncing between temporary jobs across the country. When the employment agency had called about a live and assistant position at a private residence outside San Diego, he assumed it would involve organizing files or maintaining equipment. No one had mentioned that the residence belonged to a Saruan family with technology decades ahead of anything on Earth. And no one had mentioned Lina. The hallway door slid open with a soft mechanical whisper. Inside the room, sunlight streamed through a curved glass wall that overlooked the Pacific Ocean, filling the space with golden light. Books floated slowly in small, anti-gravity shelves, holographic diagrams rotated above a glass desk, and beside the window sat a hovering chair designed with elegant alien craftsmanship. In that chair was Lina. The 12-year-old Saruan girl looked smaller than Daniel expected, her pale blue skin almost luminous under the sunlight, while long silver hair drifted weightlessly around her shoulders in the room's low-gravity field. Her eyes, a deep violet that seemed far too thoughtful for someone her age, studied him with open curiosity. An exoskeleton frame rested beside her chair, a sleek medical device, built from polished alloy and glowing neural connectors. It looked expensive. It looked complicated. And somehow it still didn't work. "You're the new one," Lina said calmly, her voice soft but sharp with intelligence. Daniel stepped into the room and offered a small smile. "Daniel Carter," he said. "I guess that's me." Lina tilted her head slightly, as if evaluating him the way a scientist examines a strange new specimen. "The last assistant left after 3 days," she said matter-of-factly. Before him, there were 4 others. Daniel glanced at the exoskeleton frame leaning beside her chair, and none of them fixed it. Lina followed his gaze. For a moment, the confident mask slipped, and something quieter appeared behind her eyes. "The best doctors from 3 planets tried," she said softly. They all said the same thing. Daniel didn't ask what that sentence was. He already knew. Instead, he walked closer to the exoskeleton and crouched beside it, studying the neural interface connections along the inner frame. Something about the calibration looked strange. Not broken exactly, just wrong. The kind of wrong that made engineers uneasy. Behind him, Lina watched carefully. "You're looking at it like the others didn't," she said. Daniel ran a finger along one of the sensor plates, frowning slightly as the device hummed under his touch. "Maybe they were looking at it the way humans would," he said quietly. Lina blinked once. "And that's bad." Daniel glanced back at her with a small, thoughtful smile. "Only if the patient isn't human." For the first time since he entered the room, the alien girl laughed softly, a sound like wind chimes moving through still air. And somewhere deep in the mansion, a story that had been stuck for 3 long years quietly began to move again. Daniel Carter had spent enough years around machines to recognize when something was wrong, but not broken. As he crouched beside the exoskeleton frame, the device hummed softly under the mansion's quiet ambient systems, its neural ports glowing faintly like tiny blue stars. The design was elegant, undeniably advanced, but the calibration grid scrolling across his tablet made him tilt his head slightly. The system was translating nerve impulses based on human spinal architecture. Lina's was close, but not identical. That difference was small enough to fool a computer, but large enough to confuse a body trying to walk again. Daniel tapped the interface lightly, and the frame emitted a soft mechanical chirp. Behind him, Lionel watched with open fascination, her violet eyes tracking every movement of his hands. Most visitors spoke slowly around her, as if her injury had also slowed her mind. Daniel had not done that once. "You are not certified to work on Saruan medical equipment," she said carefully after a moment. Daniel chuckled quietly. "That is true. Then why are you adjusting it?" she asked. He glanced back toward her chair, sunlight reflecting off the ocean behind her like a sheet of silver glass. "Because whoever designed this assumed your nervous system behaves exactly like a human one," he said. "It does not." Lionel's brows lifted slightly. "I told them that," she replied. "They said the difference was statistically insignificant." Daniel leaned back against the wall, thinking for a moment while the soft hum of the estate's environmental systems filled the room. Somewhere down the hall, a distant door slid open and closed with quiet precision. The house itself felt alive, full of quiet technology operating smoothly behind every wall. "Statistically insignificant is engineer language for, we do not want to redesign the entire system," Daniel said finally. Lionel studied him carefully. "You would redesign it?" Daniel looked down at the exoskeleton frame again. It was a beautiful piece of machinery. Lightweight alloy ribs, neural relay plates thinner than a credit card, actuators capable of supporting several hundred pounds. On paper it should have worked perfectly. "Not redesign," he said slowly. "Just listen to it differently." Lionel leaned forward slightly in her chair. "Listen to a machine?" Daniel shrugged. "Machines talk, just not with words." For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the distant crash of Pacific waves against the cliffs below the estate. Then Lionel smiled again, a quiet smile filled with the curiosity of someone who had spent 3 years watching people fail around her. "All right, Mr. Carter," she said. "What does it say?" Daniel connected the tablet directly into the neural interface and began running a slow diagnostic sweep. The data streamed across the screen in shifting graphs and pulsing signal patterns. He watched the waveforms carefully, adjusting the gain levels and response thresholds one by one. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then 30. Finally, he exhaled slowly and shook his head. "It is trying too hard," he said. "Too hard?" Lionel asked. "The system expects perfect signals from your spine before it activates the motors," Daniel explained. "Human doctors love precision." He tapped the screen again and lowered the neural sensitivity range. The exoskeleton gave a gentle mechanical whir as the internal servos recalibrated. "But bodies are messy," he continued, "especially after injuries." Lionel watched the frame carefully as its lights shifted from blue to soft white. "You changed something," she said. Daniel nodded. "Only the way it listens." He stood and gently rolled the exoskeleton closer to her chair. "Would you like to try something?" Lionel looked down at the frame, then back at him. For a moment, uncertainty crossed her face, the kind of quiet hesitation that came from too many attempts and too many disappointments. Then she straightened slightly in her chair. "Yes," she said. Daniel smiled softly as he began securing the frame around her legs. Somewhere deep in the mansion, unnoticed by the rest of the world, a very small experiment was about to begin. The exoskeleton frame locked gently around Lionel's legs with a series of soft clicks, each magnetic clasp sealing into place with quiet precision. Daniel knelt beside her, tightening the final strap along her ankle while the system's interface projected a small column of data across his tablet. Outside the curved window, the Pacific Ocean stretched to the horizon, sunlight scattering across the water in long golden reflections that slowly drifted across the walls of the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lionel looked down at the sleek metal supports surrounding her legs, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest of her hovering chair. She had worn the device many times before. She knew the weight of it, the silence that came before disappointment. Daniel noticed the tension in her shoulders and gave a small, reassuring nod. "We are not trying to run a marathon," he said calmly. "We are just asking your legs to remember what standing feels like." Lionel let out a slow breath. "The doctors always said that first." Daniel smiled faintly. "Doctors like dramatic speeches." He tapped the tablet once, and the exoskeleton emitted a low mechanical hum as the internal motors activated. The lights along the frame shifted to a soft white glow that reflected faintly on the polished floor. Daniel stepped slightly to the side, but stayed close enough to catch her if she lost balance. All right, he said gently. Let us start with something simple. Think about standing. Do not force it. Just imagine the movement. Lina closed her eyes for a moment. The ocean wind outside brushed faintly against the glass wall, and somewhere far below waves broke softly against the cliffs. For 3 years, she had imagined this exact moment. Most of those attempts had ended with silence and sympathetic expressions from specialists who eventually packed their equipment and left. But Daniel's voice carried none of that careful pity. He sounded curious, almost relaxed. Slowly Lina opened her eyes again. Nothing is happening, she said quietly. Daniel glanced down at the signal monitor. A thin line pulsed faintly across the screen. It was weak, but it was there. Actually, something is happening, he said. Your spine is sending signals. They are just shy. Lina frowned slightly. Shy. Daniel adjusted the neural gain again and nodded toward the frame around her legs. Machines are impatient. Bodies are not. He crouched beside the chair and pointed gently toward her right foot. Try again. Only this time, do not tell your legs what to do. Just think about the floor. Lina hesitated, then focused downward. For several seconds, nothing changed. The room remained still except for the soft hum of the exoskeleton's servos waiting for instruction. Then a faint vibration traveled through the frame. Daniel's eyes flicked back to the tablet. The signal line jumped slightly higher. There it is, he whispered almost to himself. Lina blinked. What? The exoskeleton responded before he could answer. One of the actuator joints moved half an inch, lifting her heel just barely above the floor before settling again. The movement was small, so small that most people might have missed it. But Lina felt it instantly. Her breath caught. Did I just? Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes still on the screen as the signal waveform continued flickering with new activity. Yes, he said quietly. You did. Lina stared down at her foot as if it belonged to someone else. For 3 years it had been silent, unresponsive, a part of her body that doctors described using words like permanent and irreversible. Yet the exoskeleton's sensor lights now blinked gently, as if responding to a language that had been asleep but never truly gone. Daniel stood carefully and looked at her with the calm expression of someone observing a promising experiment. That, he said softly, was your nervous system remembering something. Lina looked back up at him, her violet eyes wide with disbelief. It moved, she whispered. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. And we only just started listening. The room remained silent after the small movement, the kind of silence that felt fragile, as if any sudden sound might break the moment. Lina continued staring at her foot, the sleek metal frame still humming softly around her legs. Daniel did not rush her. He had learned long ago that progress and rehabilitation never came from pressure. It came from patience, from letting the body rediscover things it had once known without fear. Outside the curved glass wall, the afternoon sun had begun drifting lower over the Pacific Ocean, painting the waves with long ribbons of amber light. The estate's intelligent lighting adjusted automatically, casting a warm glow across the polished floor. Lina slowly lifted her eyes toward Daniel, her expression still caught between disbelief and cautious hope. That was not the machine, was it? She asked quietly. Daniel shook his head once. The machine only listens, he said. Your body did the rest. She looked down again, concentrating the way someone might study a puzzle that suddenly revealed one corner of the answer. For 3 years her legs had been silent, unresponsive to every command her mind tried to send. Doctors from Earth and distant Saruan medical institutes had examined her neural pathways with equipment more advanced than most hospitals possessed. Every conclusion had been the same. The injury had interrupted the signals traveling from her spine. The brain still knew how to walk. The body simply could not hear it anymore. Yet the exoskeleton around her legs now glowed softly, its neural plates pulsing with faint signals that Daniel's tablet translated into thin dancing lines across the screen. Daniel watched the data quietly, adjusting a single parameter while Lina focused again. Let us try something slightly different, he said gently. This time do not think about moving your foot. Think about shifting your weight. Lina frowned slightly. Weight. Daniel nodded toward the floor beneath her. Standing is not about lifting your feet. It is about balance. She inhaled slowly and placed her hands against the arms of the chair. The room felt unusually still. Even the distant ocean seemed quieter. Somehow, the steady rhythm of waves barely audible through the reinforced glass. Lina concentrated again. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the exoskeleton emitted a soft mechanical response as one of its stabilizers activated. Daniel's eyes flicked to the tablet. The neural signal had grown stronger. Not strong, but clearer, like a voice that had finally decided to speak above a whisper. Good, Daniel said softly. Do you feel that? Lina nodded slowly. It feels like pressure, she said. Like my legs are remembering the floor. The right actuator moved again, lifting her heels slightly higher than before settling back into position. This time the motion was unmistakable. Lina's breath caught, and her hands tightened around the chair's armrests. It did it again, she said in astonishment. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. Your nervous system is waking up pathways that have been quiet for a long time, he explained. That takes practice. Lina stared at the frame around her legs as if it had suddenly become the most fascinating machine in the galaxy. Practice, she repeated slowly. You mean this might actually work? Daniel leaned against the nearby console, folding his arms thoughtfully while watching the shifting lines on the monitor. I mean, he said calmly, your body just proved it has not forgotten how to try. For a moment Lina said nothing. Then a quiet laugh escaped her, light and uncertain, but filled with something that had not lived in this room for a long time. Hope. The next morning sunlight returned through the wide glass wall, softer than the day before, filtered by a thin layer of ocean fog rolling slowly across the Pacific. The Thalira estate woke quietly as automated systems adjusted temperature and lighting throughout the massive mansion. Down the hallway, distant footsteps from the household staff echoed briefly before fading again into silence. Inside Lina's room, the exoskeleton stood beside the hovering chair, its alloy frame reflecting the pale gold morning light, like a sculpture waiting patiently to be used. Daniel Carter leaned over the console beside the window, reviewing the data logs from the previous afternoon. Lines of neural signals moved steadily across the tablet display, not dramatic, not powerful, but undeniably present. Small signals, the kind that most medical algorithms would have ignored as background noise. Daniel did not ignore them. He studied them the way a mechanic listens to the faint change in an engine sound that no one else notices. Behind him, Lina watched from her chair, her violet eyes filled with the restless curiosity of someone who had spent years watching other people give up on her body. You came back, she said quietly. Daniel glanced over his shoulder and gave a casual shrug. You did not think I would. Lina tilted her head slightly. Most specialists stay until they confirm failure, she replied. Then they leave. Daniel set the tablet down and walked toward the exoskeleton frame. Yesterday was not failure, he said calmly. Yesterday was proof. He knelt beside the frame and began checking the neural connectors, tightening a small adjustment bolt along the knee actuator. The machine responded with a soft mechanical chirp as it powered up. Lina watched him work for a moment before speaking again. My mother will not approve of this, she said carefully. Daniel glanced up. Why not? Lina looked toward the doorway, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Because hope is expensive, she said softly. Doctors promised her miracles before. Daniel paused for a moment, considering that answer. Then he returned to tightening the connector plate with slow, deliberate movements. Machines do not promise miracles, he said. They respond to physics. Lina studied him carefully. And people? Daniel stood and rolled the exoskeleton closer to her chair again. The device hummed quietly, its internal systems ready to respond. People, he said thoughtfully, decide whether something is worth trying. Lina looked down at the frame surrounding her legs once more. The memory of yesterday's movement still lingered in her mind like a spark that refused to go out. Slowly she nodded. All right, she said. Daniel helped secure the magnetic clasps along her calves and ankles while the neural interface lights blinked softly. Outside, the fog had begun lifting from the ocean, revealing bright blue water stretching toward the horizon. The room felt calmer than it had the day before, as if the house itself had grown used to the idea of this quiet experiment continuing. Daniel stepped back slightly and picked up the tablet again. Same exercise as yesterday, he said. Only this time do not rush the signal. Lina closed her eyes and concentrated. Seconds passed. The exoskeleton remained still, waiting. Then the tablet beeped softly. Daniel looked down and raised one eyebrow. The signal was stronger today. Not dramatically stronger, but clearer, more confident, like a voice learning how to speak again after a long silence. The actuator moved half an inch, then another fraction. Lionel felt it immediately, and her eyes opened wide. "It moved sooner," she whispered. Daniel nodded slowly while watching the data climb. "Your nervous system remembers what we practiced," he said quietly. Lionel looked down at her legs, then back at him with something new shining in her expression. Not disbelief this time. Determination. Somewhere deep in the mansion, unnoticed by its powerful owner and silent hallways of wealth, a girl who had once stopped dreaming had begun trying again. For the next few days, Daniel Carter and Lionel followed the same routine, each attempt building on the last. Every movement, every second of focus, felt like a small victory in a world that had almost forgotten the meaning of progress. Lionel's body was responding, slowly but unmistakably. Her legs were still stiff, uncooperative, but the subtle shifts, the quiet adjustments, gave her hope. It had been years since she'd felt anything close to it. Each time she stood, each time she tried to move, it felt less like a dream and more like something within reach. The mansion around them remained the same, vast, quiet, and full of whispered echoes of power. Lady Soraya had kept her distance, as if unsure what to make of the quiet revolution unfolding in her home. She had not asked many questions, though the few she had asked had been sharp, calculated, as if she were weighing the risks of hope. Daniel had always answered in a calm, measured way, never promising too much, just describing what he saw. The slow, steady improvement of Lionel's nervous system. There were no grand speeches, no promises of instant success. Just data, slow and deliberate. "Try again," Daniel said one afternoon, watching as Lionel once again settled into the chair. "This time, let your body lead." Lionel hesitated, glancing down at her legs. She was tired, more than she had ever admitted. The physical strain was immense, and her muscles screamed in protest each time she moved. Yet, there was something inside her now, a quiet determination, a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "I'm ready," she said softly. Daniel nodded, his fingers moving over the tablet's interface, adjusting the settings one more time. The neural interface whirred gently, the frame around her legs humming in response. "Just think about standing, Lionel," he said. "Not about walking, not about the steps. Just standing. Let the machine help, but you guide it." Lionel closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, pushing all her doubts to the back of her mind. She could feel the exoskeleton resting against her legs, the soft pressure of it cradling her. She could feel her weight shifting slightly as the actuators adjusted, pushing her into an upright position. Slowly, like a fragile flower opening to the sun, she felt her body respond. Her feet pressed against the floor, her legs trembling slightly, but holding her steady. Her breath quickened, but she held her ground. "It's working," she whispered to herself, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. The muscles in her legs felt weak, unaccustomed to the pressure, but they didn't collapse. For the first time in years, she was standing. Not perfectly, not without effort, but she was standing. "You're doing it," Daniel said quietly, watching the tiny signals on the tablet as they fluctuated. "You're doing it, Lionel." She opened her eyes then, her violet gaze locking onto his. A small, tentative smile curled at the edges of her lips, a smile that grew slightly as the minutes passed, and she felt more stable, more confident in her ability to hold herself. She was still leaning slightly to the side, still unsure of the full weight of her legs, but the ground beneath her felt solid. She was no longer drifting. "I don't feel broken," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel stood silently, nodding. "You never were." The words lingered in the air between them, quiet but profound. For a moment, the outside world seemed far away. The vast mansion, the quiet ocean, everything was still as Lionel stood on her own 2 feet. And somewhere, deep inside her, the smallest spark of a new beginning began to glow brighter. Lionel stood in front of the full-length mirror in her room, her gaze locked on her reflection. Her legs were still unsteady, but the exoskeleton had given her the ability to stand without support, to feel the weight of her body grounded to the floor. She had spent years in a chair, years dreaming of this moment. But now that it was real, it felt different than she had imagined. She looked down at the frame surrounding her legs. The same frame that had once been just a machine, an unfeeling tool designed to compensate for what her body had lost. But now it felt like a partner. A partner that was helping her take back control. She shifted her weight slightly, and the machine adjusted, responding to the movement as it had been designed to do. The small vibrations from the motors were subtle, but they were becoming more familiar, more natural with each passing day. She felt her legs tremble, the muscles still weak from years of disuse, but they held her steady. She wasn't falling. She wasn't broken. "You're doing it." Daniel's voice came from the doorway, pulling her out of her thoughts. She turned to face him, surprised to find him standing there, his arms crossed in that familiar, thoughtful way he always had. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Long enough," Daniel replied with a slight smile. "I think you're ready to try walking." The words hung in the air for a moment before Lyanna could fully process them. "Walking," she repeated, her voice full of disbelief. "You've been standing for a while now, and the neural signals are stronger than ever," he explained, walking over to her slowly. "The exoskeleton is responding well. I think it's time to see what happens when you move." Lyanna stared at him for a moment, unsure of whether she was ready for what he was suggesting. Walking had always seemed like something too far out of reach, a distant dream she'd allowed herself to want but never expected to touch. And now, here he was, asking her to take the next step. Literally. "I'm not sure," she said, shaking her head. Her breath caught in her throat as the weight of the suggestion settled over her. "I don't know if I can." Daniel stepped closer, his gaze steady and warm. "You won't know until you try." Lyanna inhaled deeply and glanced down at her legs again. The weight of the exoskeleton seemed lighter now, less like a burden and more like something she could control. She slowly shifted her weight, first to one foot, then to the other. The movement was hesitant at first, but it felt less foreign than it had in the past. "Okay," she whispered, almost to herself. "Okay." With a deep breath, she took her first step forward. The exoskeleton adjusted seamlessly, guiding her as her foot shifted forward, the lightest of movements, but a movement nonetheless. She felt the subtle pull of the frame as it corrected her posture, keeping her from falling. The floor beneath her was solid. The world around her was no longer distant or unyielding. She could feel herself standing. She could feel herself moving. Her second step was more confident. The third was smoother. And before long, she was walking, slow but steady, her feet lifting off the ground with each careful step. It was nothing like the perfect strides of the past, but it was progress. The exoskeleton hummed quietly, supporting her with each movement, responding to her shifting balance. And for the first time in years, Lyanna felt something she had almost forgotten: control. Daniel stood behind her, watching her with quiet pride. "Look at you," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You're walking." Lyanna paused for a moment, her breath a little faster, her muscles sore from the unfamiliar movement. She turned to him slowly, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I'm walking," she repeated, as if saying the words aloud made them real. For the first time in years, she felt like the world was no longer something out of her reach. It was something she could touch again, and it was only the beginning. Lyanna woke to the soft chime of her room's notification system, the steady hum of the estate's automated systems filling the air like a quiet backdrop. The sunlight streaming through the glass wall was different today, brighter, warmer. She could feel it on her skin, a welcome contrast to the lingering chill of the previous week. Her legs were still sore, her muscles protesting every time she moved, but it was a good kind of soreness. It was the kind of soreness that meant progress, the kind of soreness that meant she was alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She stretched carefully, her arms reaching toward the ceiling, the exoskeleton still attached to her legs, waiting for her to move. A soft, quiet click told her the frame was activated, ready for whatever she was about to do. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the frame settle beneath her, the familiar hum filling the air. It had become second nature now. The frame, the neural interface, the slow, deliberate movements. But something was different today. Something inside her had shifted. It had been almost a week since she had taken her first steps. Daniel had been cautious, urging her to move slowly, to listen to her body. But today, as she stood and tested her weight against the floor, she felt stronger, more confident. She moved toward the mirror, her reflection staring back at her as she took tentative steps across the room. The process was still slow, but it was smoother, more fluid. She felt less like she was relying on the machine and more like she was using it as an extension of herself. Lioness stopped in front of the mirror, her eyes meeting her own reflection. She looked different. Her posture was more upright, her steps more balanced. Her legs were still shaking slightly, still uncertain, but they were holding her steady. Her breathing was even. She didn't feel like the same person who had sat helplessly in that chair, waiting for someone else to fix her. She had taken the first step toward fixing herself, and the next one was hers to take. She reached down, adjusting the settings on the exoskeleton with practiced hands, tuning the interface to match her body's rhythm. For a moment, the world outside seemed to fade, and all that mattered was the soft hum of the machine beneath her and the steady beat of her heart. Ready? Daniel's voice broke the stillness of the room, calm and steady as always. She turned toward him, her face breaking into a smile. Ready, she said, her voice steady and sure. Daniel watched her carefully, his eyes reflecting the quiet pride that had been building over the past few days. He had seen her struggle, seen her fight to keep going, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against her. And now, he was seeing the result of that fight, the quiet strength that had always been there, waiting for her to find it again. She moved toward him, her steps more confident now, the exoskeleton adjusting to every shift in her weight. It was like watching a dancer, finding their rhythm, each movement becoming more fluid, more natural. With every step, she grew stronger, and with every step, she became more of the person she had been before, the person she could still be. You're walking, Daniel said quietly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Lina nodded, her smile widening. I am. She stopped in front of him, her legs still trembling slightly, but the uncertainty was gone. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't broken, and she wasn't alone. The exoskeleton hummed softly as she shifted her weight, the sound almost like a quiet applause for her progress. But it wasn't the machine that mattered. It was what she had done with it, what she had done for herself. What now? She asked, her voice filled with a quiet confidence. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. Now we keep going, he said softly. One step at a time. The days that followed were marked by small, but significant steps. Lina's progress continued, slow but steady, like the movement of tides that could not be rushed, yet always found their way. Each time she walked, each time she took another step, it felt less like a challenge and more like a part of her routine. The exoskeleton still hummed gently beneath her, its quiet presence a reminder of how far she had come. But it was no longer just a machine to her. It was an extension of herself, a tool that had helped her rediscover a piece of her life she had almost given up on. Daniel continued to stand by her side, his quiet support the anchor she never knew she needed. He had become something of a guide, someone who believed in her when no one else seemed to. It wasn't that he had promised anything miraculous. There were no grand speeches, no false hopes. He had simply helped her see that the fight wasn't over, that she still had a chance to win. Lina felt different. Her legs, though still unsteady at times, were beginning to feel stronger. Each movement, though not yet perfect, was more controlled. She no longer relied on the exoskeleton as much as she once did. It was still there, of course, a constant companion, but it had become something she used rather than needed. She could feel the ground beneath her in a way she hadn't in years. She could walk. She could stand. She was learning to live again. One morning, as the estate's automated systems gently began to wake the house with soft lighting and ambient sounds, Lina stood by the window, looking out at the ocean below. The horizon was faintly tinged with the colors of dawn, and for the first time, she truly appreciated the stillness of it. The world around her had always felt distant before, out of reach, like a place she could never touch. But now, standing on her own 2 feet, she felt a quiet connection to it. She wasn't just a passenger in her own life anymore. She was a part of it. She turned when she heard Daniel's voice behind her. Ready for today's challenge? He asked, his voice steady as ever. Lina smiled, a small but genuine smile, the kind that came with knowing she had already conquered so much. I think so, she said. Her voice, once uncertain, now carried a confidence that she hadn't known she possessed. Daniel grinned, a slight but proud grin. Let's take it one step at a time, he said. Lina nodded, feeling the familiar weight of the exoskeleton around her legs. She felt a sense of gratitude for it, for what it had given her. But more than that, she felt something else, hope. Hope for what was still to come. The world outside was still vast and unknown, but it didn't matter. She was ready to face it. Lina took a step forward, feeling the ground beneath her shift as she moved. Each step felt lighter, more natural. The soreness in her muscles had become something familiar, a reminder that she was still alive, still pushing forward. She walked toward Daniel, her steps steady, her heart light. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And in that moment, it was more than enough. The journey she had started was far from over, but it didn't matter. She was walking, and that was all that mattered. Daniel watched her with quiet pride, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. And as Lina walked toward him, the world seemed just a little bit brighter.